It happened in a moment so quiet, I almost didn't notice it. His eyes locked on mine, then drifted lower, and everything around us seemed to stop. The music in the background faded, then my hands felt cold, but my chest was burning. That he froze, not moving, not blinking, as if the world had handed him something he didn't know how to hold. That I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and uneven. In that pause, every fear I'd carried for years rushed back, the whispers, the stares, the times I wished I could disappear. That I wanted to speak, to explain, but my voice wouldn't come. That I didn't know if this was the moment he'd turn away, or the moment everything would finally begin. It happened in a moment so quiet, I almost didn't notice it, yet I felt it through my skin like a sudden drop in temperature. His eyes met mine, then shifted down just slightly, and his body seemed to still, as if every muscle had been caught in a single breath. The hum of voices in the background blurred into nothing. Even the faint beat of music playing somewhere nearby seemed to vanish. My hands, which had been resting loosely in my lap, began to feel strangely cold, while my chest burned with an ache I couldn't name. I remember swallowing, slowly, trying to steady myself, but it felt like something inside me had already tilted off balance. He didn't say a word. He just froze, looking at me in a way that was neither cruel nor gentle, just unreadable. And in that unreadable silence, the memories came. Years of holding back the truth of who I was, years of carefully wrapping parts of myself in layers of excuses and half-smiles, came rushing forward. I thought of the first time someone looked at me differently, back when I was a teenager and still trying to pretend I didn't feel what I felt. That same feeling was there now, crawling over my skin, only this time I was older, and the stakes felt heavier. I could almost hear the voices from my past, the ones that taught me to hide. Don't say too much. Don't look too long. Don't give them a reason to see you. My chest rose and fell quickly, though I tried to keep my face still. The truth was, I had known this moment might come. I had imagined it on lonely nights, lying awake, wondering if one day I would meet someone who would see more of me than I had planned to show. And now, sitting here with him, I was feeling the exact thing I had both feared and quietly wished for. I wanted to break the silence, to fill the air with something that could soften whatever thought was passing through his mind. But my voice stayed trapped somewhere deep, like a bird that didn't trust the sky enough to fly. I searched his face for clues, anything to tell me if he was about to pull away or lean in closer, but all I found was stillness. My thoughts became a storm of what-ifs. What if he laughed? What if he recoiled? What if he stood up and left without another word? And buried beneath all those fears was the smallest, most dangerous question: what if he accepted me, fully, without hesitation? That possibility scared me almost as much as rejection, because it would mean stepping into a kind of openness I had never really known. My stomach twisted as I remembered the night before, pacing in my room, telling myself I was ready to be honest no matter what it cost. I had believed it then, but now that I was here, watching his reaction, the edges of that courage began to fray. The air between us felt heavier with each passing second. I caught the faint movement of his lips, like he might say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, his gaze lingered on me, his expression shifting so slightly I wasn't sure I hadn't imagined it. A part of me wanted to look away, to break the connection before I could see his decision in his eyes. But I didn't. I stayed, rooted in my chair, bracing for whatever was coming, even though my heart thudded so hard it made my fingertips tremble. In that frozen space between us, I realized how exposed I truly was. I had opened a door I couldn't close, and whatever he saw now was unfiltered, unguarded, and entirely me. It was the kind of moment that doesn't ask for permission to happen, it just arrives, quietly but completely, and leaves you knowing nothing will be the same once it passes. And as much as I feared the outcome, there was a strange, flickering part of me that felt almost relieved. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. Not even from myself. His stillness pulled me backward in time, as if the space between us had opened a door to every moment I'd ever learned to hide. I wasn't sitting in that chair anymore. I was 12 again, standing in my bedroom with the curtains drawn, holding a secret so heavy it made my small frame feel older than it was. Back then, I didn't have the words for what I was feeling, I only knew that I noticed boys in a way I was told I shouldn't. I remembered how my heart raced when my best friend smiled at me, how I replayed the sound of his laugh at night as if it were some forbidden song I had to keep locked inside. The world around me wasn't built for boys like me, or at least that's what I had been led to believe. Every comment from relatives about finding a nice girl felt like another brick in the wall I was supposed to live behind. At school, the jokes were sharper, carrying edges that cut deep even when they were tossed out casually. I learned quickly that my survival depended on staying small and invisible. If I laughed at their jokes, they wouldn't suspect. If I kept my voice steady and never let my eyes linger too long, I could slip through unnoticed. And so, I perfected the art of pretending. The memories rushed one after another. The first time I almost told someone the truth, it was to a boy in high school who had a way of looking at me like he saw past my mask. We were sitting on the football field after dark, the bleachers empty, the smell of grass heavy in the air. I was so close to saying it, to letting it spill out. But then he mentioned a girl he liked, and just like that, I swallowed the words before they ever had a chance to live. I carried that pattern into adulthood, into every friendship and almost relationship. There was always a moment, sometimes early, sometimes late, when I'd feel the temptation to be honest. And every time, I would hear that old warning in my head, not yet. Not here. Not safe. That's why the man sitting across from me now mattered more than he could possibly know. In the weeks before this meeting, I had let myself hope, really hope, that maybe this was someone who could see all of me and not flinch. But hope is a dangerous thing when you've lived your life measuring how much of yourself to give away. As the silence between us stretched on, I felt the years of those careful calculations pressing in. I could almost feel the weight of every time I'd lied by omission, every time I'd smiled and nodded while a part of me screamed to be seen. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't easy to unlearn hiding, that it had been stitched into me over years like a second skin. I wanted him to know that if I seemed nervous, it wasn't because I didn't trust him, it was because trusting anyone felt like stepping out into the open during a storm, unsure if the rain would kiss my face or strike me down. My eyes flicked to his, trying to read if he was still frozen because he was processing or because he was deciding how to pull away. It's a strange kind of torture, being caught between your past and your present like that. In the past, I would have made a joke to change the subject or found an excuse to leave before the silence grew too heavy. But now, I was older, tired of running, tired of crafting half-truths. So I sat there, feeling every beat of my heart and every ghost of who I used to be. And as much as I feared what might come next, there was something grounding about letting him see me in this unguarded way, as if all the versions of me, young, scared, hidden, were finally sitting at the table too, watching, waiting, hoping this time the story would be different. The silence between us had stretched so far that it felt like another presence in the room, something tangible, heavy, and alive. I could hear the faintest sound of the air conditioning hum in the background, but even that seemed distant compared to the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. His eyes were still fixed on me, but they had shifted, softened just enough to make me wonder if I had imagined the sharp edge I thought I'd seen earlier. My palms felt damp against my thighs, and I forced myself not to wipe them on my jeans, as though that small movement might shatter whatever fragile balance we were both holding. I could see him take in a slow breath, his chest rising just slightly before settling again, and for a split second I thought he was about to speak. But instead, he looked away, only briefly, before meeting my eyes again, and that momentary break in our connection sent a ripple of uncertainty through me. I felt exposed, as though a bright light had been turned on inside me and there was nowhere left to hide. In my mind, I kept replaying what had just happened, that moment of him noticing, really noticing, what I had kept hidden from so many people before. The truth wasn't just in what he saw, it was in the way I carried myself, in the way my voice trembled slightly when I first greeted him, in the way my shoulders hunched ever so slightly as if bracing for impact. He had seen it, and now I was left suspended between the fear that he would reject me and the possibility that he wouldn't. My mouth felt dry, but I forced it open anyway, the words slow and deliberate. I told him, in the simplest way I could, what I needed him to understand about me. I didn't dress it up with jokes or soften it with disclaimers. I just let the truth sit there in the open air, raw and unpolished, because there was no point in hiding now. For a moment, he didn't respond, and I felt my chest tighten, preparing for the sting of silence or the polite distance that so often followed these confessions. But then his brow furrowed, not in disgust, not in disbelief, but in thought, and he leaned back slightly, as though giving himself room to absorb what I just said. That movement, small as it was, sent a strange wave of relief through me, though I didn't fully understand why. I searched his face for any sign of judgment, the kind I had been trained to detect in an instant, but what I saw instead was something slower, something almost careful. He was choosing his next words, and that in itself told me he wasn't about to say something careless. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I expected, and there was a steadiness to it that anchored me even as my nerves continued to hum. He didn't ask invasive questions or demand explanations I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he asked one simple thing: how I felt about it. The question startled me, not because it was complicated, but because so few people had ever cared to hear my answer. I stumbled through my response at first, unsure how to put years of internal battles into a few sentences, but I tried. I told him about the way I had learned to scan every room before speaking too freely, the way I'd bite my tongue when conversations turned to love or relationships, the way I'd built this instinct to protect myself at all costs. And as I spoke, I realized that my voice had stopped trembling. It was low, steady, almost calm, because in that moment, I wasn't performing, I was simply being. He didn't interrupt. He didn't glance at his phone or shift uncomfortably in his seat. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel like my words mattered. It was disarming, that kind of attention. It made me realize how rarely I had felt truly heard. I felt a flicker of something in my chest then, not quite hope, not quite trust, but something that leaned toward both. The frozen air between us began to thaw, slowly, imperceptibly, as if neither of us wanted to break it too quickly. When I finally stopped speaking, the room felt different. Lighter, somehow, though I couldn't tell if that was because of him or because I had just let go of a truth I'd been gripping for too long. He didn't smile, not yet, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and I found myself holding on to that like a fragile thread. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since he froze, I felt like maybe I could breathe again. The shift between us was subtle at first, the kind of change you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention, but I felt it deep in my bones. The air didn't feel quite as heavy anymore, and there was something in the way he sat back in his chair that told me he wasn't about to bolt. My shoulders, which had been tense since the moment I walked in, loosened just slightly, though I was still aware of every beat of my heart. He asked me something small then, not about the revelation itself but about me, what I liked to do on weekends, the kind of music I listened to, the things that made me laugh. It was such an ordinary question that it felt almost revolutionary in the moment, as if he was telling me without saying it that what he'd learned about me didn't erase everything else I was. I answered, cautiously at first, because my instinct was still to measure my words, to guard the parts of myself that felt most fragile. But as he listened, nodding in that quiet way of his, I found myself giving fuller answers, letting my sentences stretch out, adding details I usually kept tucked away. I told him about the playlists I'd made over the years, songs tied to memories I didn't often share, and how some tracks could pull me right back to being 17, walking home in the rain with my hood up, thinking the world would never really know me. He didn't just hear the words, he caught the spaces between them, the unspoken meanings, the weight of what I was trying to say without saying it outright. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant, like he didn't want to break whatever fragile rhythm we'd stumbled into. He shared a little about himself then, about the places he'd traveled to and the nights he'd spent awake thinking about the person he wanted to become. His honesty, while not as heavy as mine, had a texture to it that felt real, and it made me feel less like I was under a microscope and more like I was part of a conversation between equals. There were moments when our eyes met and held, and in those seconds, I felt something uncoil inside me, something that had been wound tight for years. The laughter came unexpectedly, a small one at first when he made a joke about his terrible cooking, and then louder when I admitted my own disasters in the kitchen. It wasn't forced laughter, the kind you use to fill space. It was easy, natural, the kind that catches you off guard and makes you forget, if only briefly, that you were ever afraid. Each time we laughed, the ice melted a little more. I became aware of how my posture had changed. I was leaning in without realizing it, drawn forward by the pull of his presence. He seemed more relaxed too, his shoulders no longer squared like a shield, his hands resting loosely on the table. We talked about places we wanted to visit, books we had meant to read but never did, and the strange little quirks we'd picked up over the years. At one point, he asked me about a dream I'd had for my life that I'd never told anyone. The question startled me because it was so specific, so intimate, but I answered honestly. I told him about wanting to live somewhere quiet, near water, where mornings could begin slowly and no one expected me to be anything other than myself. I didn't say it outright, but I think he understood that for me, that dream wasn't just about location, it was about freedom. He didn't comment on it right away, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and for once, I didn't rush to fill the silence. It felt okay to let it linger. By the time I noticed, we'd been talking for what must have been hours, though it felt like no time at all. There were still questions hanging between us, and I knew we weren't finished unpacking everything, but there was a kind of fragile trust beginning to take shape. I could feel it, like a thread stretching between us, delicate but real. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just telling my story into the void, I was being met halfway. And as I sat there, watching the way he listened, the way he seemed to weigh his responses before speaking, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something neither of us had planned for but both of us might need. The days that followed felt different, as if a quiet thread had been stitched between us in that first conversation and now it pulled us subtly toward each other. We didn't speak about the moment he froze, not directly, but it lingered between our words in every text, every late-night voice note, every small gesture that passed between us. Our connection found its rhythm in the spaces most people overlook, quick replies that carried more weight than they seemed to, the way he remembered details I had mentioned in passing, the soft tone in his voice when he said my name. I noticed myself checking my phone more often, not out of impatience but because I liked knowing he was there on the other end, existing in my day even when he wasn't physically near. I told myself to be careful, to move slowly, but each exchange pulled me further in, piece by piece. We began talking about the little things that don't seem important until you realize they're the building blocks of intimacy. He told me about the terrible TV shows he secretly loved, and I confessed my habit of overwatering plants until they nearly drowned. Somewhere in those ordinary admissions, there was safety. There was no performance, no carefully constructed version of myself. I didn't feel the need to filter every word before I sent it. When he laughed, I could hear it in my chest before it reached my ears, and when he fell silent for a few seconds too long, I found myself wondering not if he was pulling away, but what he might be thinking in that moment. Still, the fear was never entirely gone. It lived quietly in the corners of my mind, a shadow reminding me of how easily things could turn. There were nights when I stared at his messages longer than I needed to, reading between the lines for signs of hesitation, wondering if tomorrow he might decide that knowing me was more than he could handle. I hated how that fear could slip in even when things were good, but I also knew it came from years of conditioning myself to expect the worst. One night, after we had been talking for hours, I decided to test the edge of that fear. I asked him how he had felt in that moment we first met, when he saw what I had been carrying. There was a pause, a small one, but long enough for my chest to tighten. Then he told me the truth. He admitted that he had been surprised, not in a way that made him want to leave, but in a way that made him realize he didn't know as much about me as he thought. He said he froze because he didn't want to say the wrong thing, because he wanted to understand before he reacted. That admission loosened something inside me. It wasn't the grand declaration my imagination had built, but it was real, and it was enough. We drifted into softer territory after that, songs we loved, people we admired, the way certain memories had shaped us without our permission. I began to notice that I was telling him stories I hadn't told anyone else, and the strange thing was, I wasn't afraid while I was telling them. He didn't rush to fill the gaps when I hesitated, didn't press me for more than I was ready to give. Instead, he let me arrive at my own pace, and that patience was its own kind of intimacy. The more we spoke, the more I began to believe that maybe he saw me not as a collection of fragments but as a whole person, even the parts one had once thought were too heavy to share. There was one evening when I sent him a picture of a place I had always wanted to visit, a quiet lakeside with a small wooden dock stretching out into the water, and told him how I imagined mornings there, the stillness, the mist curling over the surface. He replied that it sounded like the kind of place where someone could finally breathe. I didn't respond right away, because I knew he meant more than the scenery, and I wasn't ready to put that into words just yet. But I thought about it all night, about what it would mean to find a place, or a person, where breathing didn't feel like work. And for the first time in years, the idea didn't feel impossible. The more we spoke, the more the rhythm between us began to feel like something steady, something I could lean into without bracing for the sudden drop I had always feared. I woke up most mornings now with the urge to check my phone before I even got out of bed, not because I needed to but because I wanted to see if he had left a message during the night. Sometimes it would be something simple, an offhand joke, a half-asleep thought he'd typed without worrying about making it sound perfect, and those small pieces of him felt like treasures. Other times, it would be a longer message, one that made me pause before replying because I wanted to give it the same thought he had given me. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it, without the polished edges most people use when they're trying to make a certain impression. He didn't seem interested in creating a perfect version of himself for me, and that made it easier for me to stop doing it too. Yet, even in the comfort of this growing familiarity, the old reflexes didn't disappear entirely. There were moments, sometimes in the middle of a conversation, when I'd feel a sudden tightening in my chest, a reminder that I had been here before in different ways, with different people, only to have it crumble. The memories of those endings weren't dramatic, they were quiet, unceremonious departures. A slow drift into silence, a shift in tone that told me without words that I'd revealed too much. Those memories lived in me like faint scars, invisible but present, and though I tried not to let them dictate how I moved with him, I couldn't pretend they weren't there. But he had a way of disarming that fear without even knowing it. Sometimes it was in the way he listened, really listened, without rushing me. Other times it was in the way he shared parts of himself that weren't perfect, that revealed his own vulnerabilities. One night, he told me about a time he had been deeply hurt by someone he trusted, and how it had made him wary of letting people in. He didn't frame it as a confession or a warning, it was simply part of who he was, offered without expectation. Hearing that made me realize that maybe we were both carrying different versions of the same weight. Slowly, our conversations began to stretch into places I hadn't gone with anyone in years. We talked about the futures we wanted, not in the abstract, but in the kind of detail you only share when you believe the person listening won't use it against you. I told him about my wish for a life without constant self-monitoring, where I didn't have to edit every gesture or word to fit into a version of myself that made other people comfortable. I admitted that I sometimes imagined mornings where I could wake up next to someone and not feel the need to steel myself before speaking. He didn't respond with empty reassurance. Instead, he told me he understood, and that understanding didn't feel like pity, it felt like recognition. There was one evening when we ended up talking until the sky outside my window shifted from deep blue to the faint silver of early dawn. I hadn't even noticed the hours slipping away because our words felt like they were carrying their own momentum. At some point, the conversation drifted into the topic of trust, and I found myself telling him something I had never said out loud, that trusting someone felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with my eyes closed, hoping the air would hold me instead of letting me fall. He was quiet for a moment after that, and then he said something I still think about: maybe trust isn't about knowing you won't fall. Maybe it's about believing someone will be there when you do. It was such a simple sentence, but it landed in me with the weight of something I had been needing to hear for years. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was restless, but because I felt an unfamiliar kind of peace, one that made me realize I was starting to imagine a future with him in it. And that thought, both exhilarating and terrifying, stayed with me long after the sun came up. It was in the small shifts that I first realized how much he had started to change the way I moved through the world. I caught myself walking into places I used to avoid, the ones where I always felt too visible, because I knew later I would tell him about it and he would listen without judgment. I noticed I was speaking differently too, not weighing every sentence before I said it, not trying to soften the edges of my truth just to make it more palatable. The fear was still there, but it was quieter now, like a background hum I could live with instead of a constant alarm. The strange part was, he never asked me to change. He never tried to fix me. He just kept showing up, steady and present, and somehow that made me want to step further out of the walls I'd built for myself. Our conversations had deepened into the kind you can't rush, the kind where you realize hours have passed and you're still unraveling pieces of each other. We talked about our first crushes, our earliest memories of realizing we were different, and the moments we each learned that different wasn't something the world always welcomed. He told me how, as a teenager, he'd learned to scan a room before speaking, just to gauge how safe it was to be himself. I told him how I used to practice speaking in the mirror, adjusting my voice, my expressions, as if I could rehearse my way into acceptance. We both laughed a little at the absurdity of it, but underneath the laughter was the quiet truth that those habits had been survival, not performance. That night, he sent me a photo from his childhood, blurry, taken in bad lighting, but I could still see the boy he had been, the one smiling for the camera with a kind of open innocence that life hadn't yet managed to harden. I stared at that photo longer than I meant to, thinking about how many parts of ourselves we lose along the way, and how rare it is to meet someone who makes you want to reclaim them. The next day, he surprised me by asking if I'd like to meet in person somewhere quiet, away from the noise of our usual world. The suggestion caught me off guard, not because I didn't want to see him, but because the thought of crossing that line, from messages and calls into physical space, made my pulse quicken in equal parts excitement and fear. For years, I had kept my life in neat compartments, the people who knew one part of me rarely meeting the ones who knew another. Letting him into my physical space felt like opening the last door I had kept locked. But there was something in his voice when he asked, something careful but certain, that made me say yes without overthinking. The days leading up to it were a slow storm of anticipation. I found myself imagining how it would feel to see him without a screen between us, to hear his voice as it actually sounded in the air, to watch the way he moved when he wasn't just a frame on my phone. I thought about all the things I wanted to tell him but hadn't yet, not because I couldn't, but because I was waiting for the right moment. And maybe, I thought, that moment would finally be here. On the morning we were supposed to meet, I woke up early, restless in a way I hadn't been in years. I moved through my apartment in slow, deliberate motions, noticing details I would normally ignore, the way the light hit the walls, the sound of the city outside, the rhythm of my own breathing. I caught myself wondering if he was feeling the same mixture of nerves and hope that I was, if he was replaying our conversations in his head the way I was doing with his. It struck me then that this wasn't just about meeting him. It was about meeting the version of myself that existed when I was with him, the one I didn't have to shrink or hide. And I realized, almost with a shock, that I wanted to keep that version, whether he stayed in my life or not. Still, I couldn't deny the truth, more than anything, I wanted him to stay. When I saw him walking toward me, the rest of the world blurred. There were people passing by, cars moving in the distance, the faint sound of city noise somewhere behind us, but all of it felt muffled, like my senses had narrowed down to just this moment. He smiled when our eyes met, and it wasn't the quick, polite kind of smile you give a stranger, it was the kind that unfolds slowly, like it's arriving from somewhere deep inside. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening not from fear this time, but from the sheer reality of him being here, in front of me, no longer just a voice on the other end of the line. For a moment, we didn't say anything. We just stood there, taking each other in. His presence was different in person, warmer, more grounded, and I realized that all the times we'd spoken, all the things we'd shared, had only been pieces of the whole. Now, I could see the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way his shoulders eased when he exhaled, the small tilt of his head like he was memorizing the sight of me the same way I was with him. When we finally moved closer, it felt like crossing an invisible threshold. He reached out, almost hesitantly, and I met him halfway. The first touch was simple, a hand on my arm, but it carried the weight of every conversation, every late-night confession, every moment we'd spent building something fragile and real between us. We started walking together, not toward any specific destination, just moving side by side, our steps naturally falling into the same rhythm. We talked, but the words felt different now, more vivid, as if being in the same air made everything we said carry more meaning. He told me I seemed taller than he'd imagined, and I laughed, telling him he seemed calmer than I'd expected. It was strange, how quickly the nerves I'd been carrying dissolved. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was alive, like it had its own texture. At one point, we stopped by a small park, sitting on a bench beneath a tree whose branches swayed gently in the wind. He turned toward me then, his expression shifting into something I couldn't quite name. And that was when it happened, the moment that would stay with me forever. His eyes drifted down, and I felt my stomach knot, my pulse spike. He froze, just for a breath, like the world had stopped moving around us. I felt every old fear crash back in at once, every memory of judgment, every sharp-edged comment I'd ever endured. My mind raced ahead, preparing for the worst. But then he looked up again, meeting my gaze with something so unshaken, so steady, it startled me. He didn't pull away. He didn't ask a question laced with disbelief or discomfort. Instead, his hand reached for mine, fingers curling around with quiet certainty, as if to say, without words, that he wasn't going anywhere. My chest felt tight for a different reason now, like something long locked inside me had just loosened. The air between us shifted, heavy and light at the same time, and I realized this was the moment I had always wanted but never dared to imagine could be real. We sat there for a long time, talking in low voices, sometimes not talking at all, just letting the weight of the moment settle. And when we finally stood to leave, walking toward whatever came next, I knew I was stepping into a life where I didn't have to hide the most vulnerable parts of myself anymore, because I had found someone who saw them and stayed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps me bring more real, raw, and emotional LGBTQ+ stories to life. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what this moment meant to you.